We're on Daf Kuf Tes Vav. And we're going to start from the top of the Amud. And we're going to formulate a kasha of Rav Chizda on Rav Huna. Because Rav Huna on Daf Kuf Yud Dalid Amud Beis says that when you have chazeres, or chasa as we call it, and that's your only yerek, that's all you have available, which means that for Tibul Rishon, right after the Kiddush, you're going to use chazeres, which is a min mimini morar. You recite two brachas on that first Tibul. Meaning, first of all, he needs to recite a bar priyagov, a bar priyadom. Now, what are we going to do with the bracha of alachilas mara? We're really in a bind over here because mara should be eaten after the matzah, and he's way before the matzah. So should we recite both brachos, bar priyadoma and alachilas mara, on the first tibul in this case because it is chazeres, it's mara, or shall we delay the bracha of alachilas mara till after we eat the matzah and recite the bracha on the second tibul? And Rav Huna said, well, logically you might argue he should make a bari priyadoma and alachilas mara on the first tibul. However, how can he make a bracha on the first tibul when it's before the matzah? So Rav Huna was faced with this in the bind, so to speak, and he came to the conclusion that, you know what, let's split the two brachas for the two tibul. Let's recite the bar priyadoma, of course, on the first tibul, and that'll cover us for the second tibul. But as far as alachilas mara is concerned, we don't want to make that bracha on the first tibul because we want to achieve the mitzvah of mara after matzah. So maskifle Rav Chizda, liachar shemile kreisa imenu chozer b'varach alei, he already ate the mara, and now after he eats the mara, he's going to make a bracha alachilas mara on the second tibul. It doesn't make any sense, says Rav Chizda, because the bracha always has to be over lasiyasan, and you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. Now, if I hold mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavana, then we understand Rav Chizda's objection very well. It doesn't matter whether he had kavana or he didn't have kavana on the first tibul. Nevertheless, he was yotzi his mitzvah. So now you're going to make a bracha on the second tibul. You already were yotzi your mitzvah. But even if I hold mitzvah is tzrichas kavana, and he didn't have kavana l'shem mitzvahs mara on the first tibul, nevertheless, Rav Chizda argues, Mile Kreisa V'yanu, he did the Maisa mitzvah for sure, and once he did the Maisa mitzvah, it doesn't make sense that now he's going to do the Maisa mitzvah a second time around and make a bracha on the second time around. Elam Rav Chizda meikar muvarach bar priyadoma ve'alachilas mara. Yeah, Rav Huna, you were in a bind, but you took a left turn instead of a right turn. You should have come to the conclusion that the bracha of alachilas mara should be recited on the first tibul. The achil ubasof achil achilas chasa below bracha. The second tibul with chasa, chasas chazeres, will be without a bracha. So basically, the second tibul is not for the sake of the mitzvah of marar in this particular scenario, but rather for the sake of Shnei Tibulim, which is a heker, so that the children will ask, Palayla zeh shtei piyamim. B'Surya avdi Rav Huna, the minig in Surya was to delay the bracha of alachilas marar until after the Tibul Sheni, meaning after achilas matzah, but Rav Sheshes b'reid Rabbi Yeshua avid Rav Chizda. And Rav Sheshes insisted that, like Rav Chizda, we recite both brachos on the first tibul. V'hilchas hakavasei de Rav Chizda. And the Gemara concludes that we paskin like Rav Chisda. Now, is that a proof that mitzvos einom tzrichas kavana? No. Even if mitzvos tzrichas kavana, nevertheless, the Maisa mitzvah was a Maisa mitzvah. He filled his belly up with mar. He's not going to make a bracha on the second tibul ala chilas mar. And therefore, we're going to paskin like Rav Chisda. And in this case, where he only has marar as a yerek, he's going to recite two brachos, including ala chilas marar, on the first tibul. And the second tibul now becomes a heker of Shnei Tibul. The Gemara adds, Rav Acha Brei Rav Mahadar Ashar Yerokas Lafuki Nachshim Plukta. Rav Acha was very smart. He planned in advance, seeking out another Yerek. He didn't want to get stuck with a situation that all he had was Midmi Mine Marar, because then he would get into this whole machlokes about which tibul of the two tibulim should have the bracha of Alachilus Marar. Amar Avina, Amar Li Rav Mesharshia, Bereid Rav Nasan, Hachi Amar Hillel Mishmei the Gemara. Hillel had a Kabbalah, and Lo Nichrach Inish Matzu Mar Bahari Adadi V'Nechol. No sandwiches. We do not combine korech of matzah and maror. And Hillel, an Amora, says, I have a Kabbalah that this is the case. Why? What's wrong with eating matzah and maror together? In fact, the Torah says, Al matzah sumrom yochlu. Doesn't that imply that we eat matzah and maror together? Mishum desvirle matzah bisman azed doraisa umar midrabanan. V'osi mar derabanan umevatale lamatzah doraisa. There are two premises here that Ravina is operating. One premise is that a mitzvah d'Rabbanan relative to a mitzvah d'Oraisa, like Mar Bisman Hazeh relative to matzah, is a rishus. In effect, he would be like eating his matzah together with a potato. Because on a d'Oraisa level, Maror is not a mitzvah. It's a rishus. It's like eating a potato. And premise number two is the premise of bittul. Not the bittul of tarovis, of mixtures, but a tarovis in your baron, in your throat. When you eat something, you have to eat the mitzvah. And if you eat together with the mitzvah a rishus, asi rishus umevatel mitzvah. So once I assume that Mara Bisman Hazeh D'Rabbanan is like a Rishus Klape Doraisa, now I activate the principle of Rishus Mevatel Mitzvah. And therefore, if within one Achila he has both Matzah and Mara, and Mara is like eating a potato Bisman Hazeh Klape Doraisa, then it's Mevatel the Achila of the Matzah, which is Doraisa, and you forfeited the Mitzvah Doraisa of Matzah. Again, at the time the Beis Hamikdash stood, and there was a mitzvah d'oraisa to eat maror. The Torah says, matzah sumrom yochlu. Then there's no din of asi maror umevatel mitzvah, because you can have two mitzvahs d'oraisa and eat them simultaneously. There's no bittul. But now that maror is, Bismana says, d'Rabbanan, because we don't have a korban pesach, the mitzvah of maror depends upon the korban pesach. So now maror klapia d'oraisa becomes like a rishus, and rishus is mevatel mitzvah. In other words, even though if I would eat two achilos, both of which are a mitzvah d'oraisa, that would be fine. But hanimili d'oraisa b'doraisa, because both are d'oraisa, they're equal. Neither of them is going to be mavatal the other one. Oh, D'Rabbanan b'D'Rabbanan. Let's say I had two achilos, both of which are D'Rabbanan. And once again, ein mitzvahs mevatlo zu zu. Avol, but here in this case, Doraisa D'Rabbanan, matzah is Doraisa, and Moror is D'Rabbanan. Asi D'Rabbanan mevatel mitzvah matzah Doraisa, and that is because Moror D'Rabbanan is like a rishus, and everybody agrees. There was never a debate that rishus mevatel mitzvah. Basically means that I have to define my achila. Is an achilas mitzvah or is an achilas rishus? And if I do both together simultaneously, an achilas mitzvah and an achilas rishus, and the rishus is mevatel the mitzvah, and I define the achila as an achilas rishus. And therefore, says Rav Mesharshia, we've got a problem if we eat the matzah together with the maror bizman hazeh. Man tana deshamet le mitzvahs ein mevatel zu zu. The Gemara understood that at least when they're both doraisa, then we have a leg to stand on. There's certainly a basis, a shita, that ein mevatel zu zu. Hillel, this is Hillel HaZaken, the first Hillel. He lived at the time of the Beis Hamikdash. The Sanya, Amrulav al Hillel, Shayakarchan bevas achas v'ochlan mishum shenemar al matzum rom yochlu. Hillel was not worried about mitzvahs mevatlo zu zu. Hillel at the time of the Mikdash would make a kricha. This is the famous sandwich of Hillel of matzah and maror, and he ate them simultaneously, and he fulfilled two mitzvahs, both matzah and maror, because ein mitzvahs mevatlo zu zu. But even Hillel would agree that bisman hazel yachar churban when we don't have a korban pesach, and therefore maror is not doraisa. Maror is the abundance like a rishus. Asi rishus mevatel mitzvah. Amar Rav Yochanan cholkim olav chaver bal shmuel. Now the language of Rav Yochanan here is very extreme, and Rabbi Yochanan is going to claim that the Chachamim rejected Hillel, and even with two mitzvahs doraisa, namely bisman beis hamikdash kayim and the maror is doraisa, if he eats the maror with a matzah, then we're going to apply the principle of asi umevata, that one is mevatel the other. They're both doraisa. And Rabbi Yochanan's language indicates that the Chachamim could not tolerate Hillel, meaning they could not tolerate Korech, even Bizman HaMikdash. But let's listen to the words of the Chachamim. I think Rabbi Yochanan went a little bit overboard. Sanya, Yochel Yehi Korchan b'vasachas v'ochlan, kiderech shehillel ochlan, Talmud lower al matzah umrom yochluhu, afilu zebifnei atzmo v'zebifnei atzmo. The Rabbanan quoted here in the Brisa by Rabbi Yochanan are saying that we don't have to do it the way Hillel did it. Why? Because the Torah doesn't say Ye'achlu. Ye'achlu means that they in the plural should be eaten, meaning they, matzah and maror, should be eaten in one achila. Name Yochluhu. It says it in Lashon Yachid. Zebifnei atzmo is zebifnei atzmo. But look at the word afilu. Chachamim are not rejecting Hillel. Chachamim also accept that ein mitzvahs mevatlo zu if they're both doraisa. Chachamim are only saying that the Torah doesn't require it. The mitzvah of achilas matzah and the mitzvah of achilas maror, two separate bezunder mitzvahs, independent one of the other. Do each achilas separately if you like. You want to put them together? Fine. So it's very strange that Rav Yochanan went a step further. Maskifle Rav Ashi. Ihachi. If you're telling me, Rav Yochanan, that the Chacham in this brisa refuse to allow you to eat both matzah and maror together at the time of the Mikdash, my afilu, Afilu means rashoy. You have rashus. If you want to, you can eat zebif neatzmo v'zebif neatzmo. But they never excluded the possibility of eating them both together. Ravashi completely rejects Rabbi Yochanan, hands down. Hi Tana, hachi ktani. The Tana of the Brisa is saying Yochel lo yetzi behu yidech ovaso el imkain karchu masachas v'yoch yidech she'hilel ochlon. You might think, if you don't read the pasuk carefully, that the only way that the Torah will allow you and recognize your mitzvahs, you do it the way Hill did it with a kricha. Talmud Lomar, al matzah rom yochlu afilu zeh b'fnei atzmo. You have the option of eating them separately. But the Rabbana never rejected Hillel, and the possibility is valid to eat them both together. So it comes out that the Tana of this brisa, as Rav Ashi points out, accepts the principle of Hillel. And ein mitzvahs mavat lazu if they're both doraisa, and the option of eating them together is certainly there. The only thing that the Chachamim reject about Hillel is that Hillel restricts you to only one possibility, namely to eat them together. The Chacham expand your possibilities. But it does seem, and we'll see this in the Rashbam and other Rishonim, the Balamor, the Meiri, that the Gemara had a Kabbalah. They knew from tradition that there was a sheet of Chachamim out there. It's not the sheet of Chachamim in this brisa that completely reject Hillel. And they hold that mitzvahs mavat lazu even in two mitzvahs doraisa, and you're not allowed to eat a bekricha. From this brisa, you can't prove anything, because this brisa, on the contrary, seems to assume that even the Chachamim accepted Hillel. They just thought that Hillel was mistaken when he said that the mitzvah exhausts itself in kricha and only in kricha. But the Chachamim knew that there was a shita out there. We can't pin it down on any particular Mishnah or Brisa, but there were Tanoim who were of the opinion that Hillel has to be completely rejected, and that the option of kricha is out the window, because mitzvah mavat lasu isu. And therefore, the Gemara says, Hashdid lo itmer hilchas aloke hill v'lo karabbanon. In other words, we don't know whether or not we should paskin like Hill or the Rabbanon. And the Rabbanon here could either mean the Rabbanon the Brisa, who allow you and validate eating the two matzah separately, or the Rabbanon, who al pi Kabbalah, we know they rejected kricha entirely as a possibility. And now we get to Zman Hazeh, when Mara is only the Rabbanon. Let's fulfill the mitzvah in such a way that everybody will be happy. And what do? What you're going to do is you're going to make the bracha on the matzah and eat the matzah. You're going to make the bracha on the mar and eat the mar separately. Everyone's going to be happy with that, except for Hillel. Hillel's the only one who would object. He says, wait a minute. The Torah says, you got to eat them together. And he doesn't hold from mitzvahs mevatlos. Therefore, hadar achil matzah v'chasav adi adadi below bracha zeichel amigdash kehillel. Now, again, when he says zeichel amigdash kehillel, what he means is that we're going to do it the way Hillel did it at the time that Beis Hamikdash was up and alive. Hillel never insisted that bisman hazeh, I mean, he didn't live during this time, but after the churba, we would have to eat it bekorech, because korech is only a condition in the mitzvah d'oraisa of al matzah sumram yachlu, which no longer applies, because that mitzvah depends upon the korban pesach. We don't have the korban pesach, so we have a mitzvah of mara d'rabbanan, and certainly Hillel would okay that if bisman hazeh we ate the mara separately, that would be fine. We're going to have to eat the mara separately in order to be yotzi the cheetahs who hold mitzvahs mevatlo zuzu, and probably even Hillel would agree that mitzvahs mevatlo zuzu. But nevertheless, we do want to remember the way Hillel did it back at the time of the Mikdash. And that is Bekorech. No bracha. Why no bracha? Sfir Sa'omer, Zeichel Mikdash, we make a bracha. Lulav Kol Shiva, Zeichel Mikdash, we make a bracha. Hanukkah might be Zeichel Hamikdash as well. We make a bracha. There are many, many examples of mitzvos that we fulfill Zeichel Hamikdash and we make a bracha. And there are two answers. One answer to this question could be that since we already made the bracha on Mar when we ate Mar separately, and that we absolutely had to do to satisfy the shita that mitzvahs mevatla zuasu, once we made the bracha, we're not going to recite a bracha again. If you go with that approach, then you should not be mafsik between the bracha on Mar and the korech. Mum's the word, because the bracha on the Mar has to cover the korech as well. The other approach is to say that, you know what, there are different categories of Zeichel and Migdash. There's a category of Zeichel and Migdash where there was a Takanas Chachamim to replicate today what they did in the Migdash. And then we have a Takanas Chachamim, which is just Zeichel and Migdash. Just remember what went on in the Migdash. The Rabbanan never made a separate Takana that today we have to eat the Mara and the matzah together, the kricha, as if we were standing in the Mikdash, according to Hillel. That takana was never instituted. Either because there's this Kabbalah of the Shitz Chachamim that mitzvahs mevat lezuzu, even if they're both doraisa, or because we paskin against Hillel. And there was never a requirement, an absolute requirement unconditionally of kricha, even b'tzman and Mikdash, but Rabbanan never made a takana of a separate mitzvah of a Zeichel and Migdash when it comes to Korah. The question that I have is there a precedent for a Zeichel and Migdash without a brach? Is there such a thing? And I think the answer to that question might be the mitzvah of Harav, because there was a separate mitzvah of Arava during the time of the Migdash. And when we take the Arava today, it might be Zeichel Migdash without a bracha. I don't know. I'm not sure. But this is something that has to be studied. Now we have to understand that Yodayim are called Shnios L'Tuma. And we're always afraid that Yodayim Askanio saying that he may have been in contact with something that's tum. And therefore, the Rabbanan made a gzera, they required Netilas Yodayim. But they only made that gzera with regard to something that's mukhshar l'kabel. It had to have a hechsher. So, for example, one of the machshirim l'tuma is a liquid that fell on a solid, and once the solid, let's say a fruit or a vegetable, became wet, it's mukhshar l'kabel tuma. And if we assume that Yadayim Shniyos saying, by having contact with the wet vegetable, he now is metame that vegetable with what's called a rishon l'tum. It's very interesting that in the context of the gzera of Netilas Yadayim, the Rabbanan instituted an upgrade in tum. And normally we go from a tumah chamura down a level. Here we go up a level, from shnios to rishon l'tum. Now, if kol shetibulo b'mashke tzarech Netilas Yadayim, because when a sheni l'tuma touches mashkin, the Rabbanan instituted a takon of rishon l'tuma. So then this is going to have an impact on Morar, because Morar needs Tibul. And Tibul is going to be in Charoses. And therefore, the mashke that's in the Charoses is now going to be machshir, the Morar for Kabbalah's Tumah. So he's got to wash his hands before he dips the maror into the charoses. Amar Rav Papa, Rav Papa says that if the first tibul requires netilas yadayim, because the davar shetibul b'mashka requires netilas yadayim, and that's the din of Rav Ochia, is shmami, no, we should derive from this that hai chasa, and here we turn to Daf Kuf Tes Vav and Beis, Sarach l'shkuye becharoses. There must be some reason why the Rabbanan required that the tibul be a profound tibul.